Rainwater dripped steadily from the beams of a ruined barracks outside the city of Naples. A soldier sat alone on a narrow wooden bed, staring at dark sores spreading across his hands. At first, the wounds seemed harmless, but by the time the lantern burned low, the flesh around them had begun to split and darken. The skin around them was already breaking open into black ulcers that refused to heal. By morning, several other men would discover the same marks spreading across their bodies, and the whispers would begin to move through the camp. Whatever had followed the armies home from war had already begun to move silently among the soldiers. Europe in the closing years of the 15th century was a continent still scarred by older disasters. Entire villages had vanished during waves of plague that swept through the previous century. War had burned fields and emptied towns. Trade routes were only beginning to recover, bringing merchants, soldiers, and travelers back into crowded streets. Yet along those same roads moved illnesses that no one fully understood, diseases that appeared without warning and slowly turned ordinary lives into long struggles with pain, fear, and isolation. The sickness spreading among the soldiers carried a cruel patience. At first came small sores on the skin, painless and easy to ignore. Weeks later, fevers began to rise, followed by swelling and deep wounds that opened across the body. In cities from Naples to Paris, physicians argued about what they were witnessing. Some believed poisoned air had been released from the earth during war. Others insisted the illness was divine punishment for the sins of soldiers who had looted their way across Europe. Every region blamed another, giving the disease a different name depending on who they feared most. Inside dark hospital rooms, lit only by candles, desperate treatments began. Physicians wrapped patients in heavy blankets beside heated stoves, forcing them to sweat until water pooled on the stone floor. Mercury ointment was rubbed into open wounds because doctors believed the metal could drive corruption out of the body. The treatment often poisoned the patient faster than the disease itself. In some hospitals, patients were locked inside heated rooms for days while mercury vapors filled the air. Sweat ran down their bodies as physicians waited for the poison to force the sickness out. Many staggered out, barely able to stand, their mouths swollen and bleeding. Teeth loosened and fell from swollen gums, and many victims died, gasping for breath, while the toxic vapors filled the air around them. Centuries later, scientists would finally identify the quiet enemy responsible, a microscopic bacterium that passed silently between human bodies. While armies carried that disease through crowded cities, another illness waited on the open sea. Wooden ships were leaving European harbors in growing numbers as explorers searched for new routes across the oceans. The voyages lasted months, sometimes longer, and the food stored below deck was built for survival rather than nourishment. Barrels of salted meat and sacks of dry biscuits filled the holds, but they carried almost none of the nutrients the human body needed to remain strong. During the first weeks at sea, the crews worked as usual, climbing rigging and hauling sails through storms. Then, the first signs appeared quietly. A sailor brushing his teeth noticed blood along the bristles. Another discovered dark bruises spreading across his legs without any injury. Within weeks, the illness spread through the ship like a slow shadow. Gums swelled until they covered entire rows of teeth, and wounds that had healed months earlier suddenly reopened. The smell of sickness began to mix with the scent of tar and salt water. Men who once climbed the masts with ease now collapsed on the deck, too weak to stand while the ship rolled beneath them. On some voyages, the weakest sailors were simply left lying beside the cannons while the rest of the crew struggled to keep the ship moving. Teeth fell from their mouths during storms, clattering across the wooden planks as waves struck the hull. Ship surgeons tried every remedy they could imagine. Some forced sailors to drink vinegar mixed with seawater. Others bled their patients with knives, believing the body contained too much corrupted blood. None of it stopped the disease that would later be called scurvy. Entire expeditions sometimes lost half their crews before reaching land. Only centuries later did physicians discover that the illness came from the absence of vitamin C, a simple nutrient destroyed during long storage of food. When explorers finally began carrying citrus fruits aboard their ships, the mysterious weakness that haunted the oceans began to disappear. Far from the crowded cities and the long sea voyages, another danger waited in the quiet fields of rural Europe. Farmers worked daily with cattle and sheep, slaughtering livestock and cutting hides for trade. Their hands were covered with small cuts from knives and rough tools. Most wounds healed quickly beneath layers of dirt and sweat. Occasionally, one of those cuts changed. A shepherd might notice a small black swelling forming on his arm after handling a sick animal. At first, the mark looked harmless, no larger than a coin. Within days, the swelling hardened into a dark lesion surrounded by angry red skin. Fever followed quickly, and the victim weakened with alarming speed. Villagers watched in fear as a healthy farmer became bedridden within days. Priests were often called before physicians. Some villagers believed the illness rose from cursed soil disturbed by storms. Others blamed spirits that lived among the animals grazing on distant hills. Physicians who did arrive sometimes attempted to cut away the infected flesh with heated blades, hoping to remove the corruption before it spread deeper into the body. The disease was anthrax, a bacterium that lived quietly in the soil and inside the bodies of livestock. Its invisible spores entered the human body through tiny wounds and multiplied rapidly in blood and tissue. The black lesions that frightened villagers were only the surface of an infection spreading beneath the skin. Long before microscopes could reveal the organism responsible, rural communities had already learned to fear certain pastures and animals where death seemed to linger. Another terror arrived through the jaws of wandering animals. In many towns, dogs roamed freely through the streets, scavenging scraps from markets and slaughterhouses. A bite from one of these animals rarely caused alarm at first. Wounds from hunting accidents and farm work were common, and most healed without difficulty. But sometimes the bite carried something far more dangerous. Days or weeks after the injury, the victim might wake with a fever and a strange agitation that refused to fade. Muscles tightened in the throat, making it difficult to swallow even a mouthful of water. Soon, the mere sight of water caused violent spasms that forced the body backward in terror. Neighbors whispered that the victim was becoming possessed. Voices grew hoarse and strained. Some victims snapped their jaws or lashed out at anyone who came too close. Sometimes, entire families locked the sick inside barns or sheds, terrified that a bite might spread the same madness. In some villages, neighbors nailed the doors shut from the outside, leaving food beside the entrance while the victim raged inside. Dogs, suspected of carrying the illness, were beaten to death in the streets while crowds watched in fearful silence. Physicians tried brutal treatments that rarely changed the outcome. The bite wound was burned with hot iron in the belief that fire might destroy the poison within the flesh. Herbal mixtures were forced down the patient's throat despite the violent spasms that made swallowing almost impossible. Once the symptoms appeared, death almost always followed. The illness was rabies, a virus carried in the saliva of infected animals. It traveled slowly through the nerves toward the brain, turning a small bite into a fatal disease weeks later. Medieval communities knew nothing of viruses, yet they recognized the horror of the symptoms long before science could explain them. Fear of disease sometimes produced events even stranger than the illnesses themselves. In the summer heat of Strasbourg, people gathering in the marketplace witnessed something no physician could explain. A woman stepped into the open square and began to dance. At first, the crowd laughed. Music and street performers were common in city festivals, but the woman did not stop. Hours passed as her movements grew more frantic, her face twisting in exhaustion. When she collapsed from fatigue, she rose again and continued moving as though forced by some invisible power. Within days, Dozens of people joined her. Men and women danced through the streets without music, their feet pounding the cobblestones until blood soaked through their shoes. Some begged for the movement to stop, while their bodies continued jerking uncontrollably. Witnesses described dancers collapsing with broken ribs or bleeding feet, only to rise again and continue their desperate motion. Authorities feared divine punishment. Priests organized prayers while physicians debated the cause. Some doctors believed corrupted blood had overheated the body and forced it into uncontrollable movement. In a desperate attempt to cure the dancers, officials built wooden stages and hired musicians to accompany them, hoping they would exhaust themselves and recover. The strange outbreak eventually faded as suddenly as it had begun. Modern historians suspect a form of mass hysteria, driven by years of famine, disease, and social stress. Yet for the people who watched their neighbors collapse in the streets, the event seemed like proof that unseen forces could seize the human body without warning. Across Europe, these diseases shaped daily life in ways that few people today could imagine. Families hid sick relatives to avoid quarantine. Travelers were turned away from city gates if they appeared weak or feverish. Physicians argued fiercely about causes, while patients endured treatments that often caused as much suffering as the diseases themselves. Yet slowly, a different way of understanding illness began to emerge. Some physicians started to doubt the ancient belief that disease came only from imbalances of blood or poisoned air drifting through the atmosphere. They began studying the human body itself. Despite religious objections, anatomists dissected corpses to map the hidden structures beneath the skin. Muscles, organs, and nerves were recorded in careful drawings. These early investigations revealed something unsettling. The human body was not governed by mysterious vapors alone, but by complex physical systems that could be studied and understood. A few thinkers began to wonder whether disease might also have physical causes invisible to the eye. In the 16th century, an Italian physician named Girolamo Fracastoro proposed a dangerous idea. He suggested that diseases might spread through invisible particles of contagion, moving from body to body. The theory challenged centuries of accepted medical belief and was widely dismissed by many scholars. Yet it planted the first fragile seed of a scientific explanation. Elsewhere, physicians began keeping detailed records of symptoms, treatments, and outcomes. Sailors, returning from distant voyages, carried unfamiliar plants and fruits that scholars studied carefully. Some observers noticed that sailors who ate citrus fruits rarely developed the devastating weakness that once haunted long journeys at sea. Gradually, patterns emerged from centuries of suffering. Ship captains began storing lemons and limes in their provisions to protect their crews. Farmers learned to burn the remains of animals that died from strange infections. Communities recognized the danger of animal bites and began killing dogs suspected of carrying rabies before the disease could spread. The change came slowly, often too slowly for the people suffering through these diseases. Old beliefs about corrupted air and divine punishment remained powerful for generations. But alongside those traditions, a new method of understanding disease was slowly taking shape. Observation replaced guesswork. Experiment replaced superstition. In small laboratories and workshops, scholars experimented with chemicals and studied plant extracts. Early microscopes revealed tiny moving shapes in drops of water, suggesting that an invisible world existed beyond the limits of human sight. These discoveries hinted that diseases might come from living organisms too small to be seen without magnification. The realization arrived slowly, but carried enormous consequences. Humanity had spent centuries fighting illnesses without knowing their true enemies. Soldiers, sailors, farmers, and entire cities had struggled against invisible organisms that moved silently through water, food, animals, and human bodies. The suffering of those earlier generations became the foundation of scientific medicine. Every failed treatment, every desperate experiment, and every unexplained death forced physicians to question the beliefs they had inherited. By the time modern medical science began to form, Europe had already endured centuries of disease and fear. The scars left by those illnesses shaped hospitals, universities, and the new methods of research that slowly replaced superstition. Within laboratories illuminated by candlelight and early glass lenses, scholars began observing the hidden structures of life itself. The world of disease was no longer explained by curses or divine punishment, but by organisms that could be studied, identified, and eventually controlled. The quiet scratching of pens across paper replaced the whispers of rumor and fear that once filled crowded marketplaces. Observations were recorded, experiments repeated, and theories tested against evidence. From the suffering of countless lives emerged the first clear understanding of the invisible forces that shaped human health. The diseases that once terrified entire continents gradually revealed their secrets. For centuries, humanity had lived beside invisible enemies without knowing they existed. Under the glow of early microscopes and the scratch of quills across paper, the hidden causes of disease finally began to reveal themselves. And from that long struggle, medicine began its transformation from fear and guesswork into science.